Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name is David Nilsen. As Clay said, I'm a full-time food and beverage writer and educator, primarily focused on craft beer and craft chocolate. And the talk we're going to have today is From Bean to Barstool and Back: Collaboration and Commonality Between Chocolate, Beer, and Spirits. So we're going to be talking all about opportunities for collaboration between these two worlds and kind of some of the cool stuff that's out there that you can check out. A little bit more about me. I came from craft beer originally, so that is still where most of my work resides. I'm a member of the North American and British Guilds of Beer Writers, and I'm an advanced Cicerone, which is the beer equivalent of being an advanced wine sommelier, basically. So I like to joke that I'm a beer geek with a certificate to prove it. Many people here would know me primarily from Bean to Barstool that Clay was just mentioning. That is a podcast and a website where we talk about all the stuff that I'm going to be looking at in this talk, all sorts of intersections between craft chocolate and beverage alcohol. You can check that out on beantobarstool.com. And as he said, we've got the booth out there, so you can come and visit with us and find out some more about what we do. So coming from beer originally, I got into craft chocolate about 7 or 8 years ago, and one of the things that I was really excited about as I was getting into it was discovering how many things these industries actually had in common. Even though the products themselves, beer and chocolate, are very different, the industries themselves culturally and some of the problems that they were facing, some of the conversations they were having were very, very similar. So arguments about what the definition of craft should mean and how big a business should be. Is it too big to be craft, and things like that were happening on both sides. One of the things that I really enjoyed, especially about that originally drew me to craft beer and then also drew me in with craft chocolate, is that neither of these industries took themselves too seriously. They were willing to experiment and play with interesting ingredients, where while I love wine and I love bourbon and I love coffee, you have these kind of rigid traditions with those where you're not allowed to just throw whatever fun ingredient you want into a Pinot Noir and have that taken seriously. So with beer and chocolate, they work as platforms for interesting flavors, and you can just kind of have fun and do different things with that. And with that, I was really excited to find out that they work together all the time. They had kind of noticed those things about each other. So craft breweries and craft chocolate makers in particular were doing a lot of exchange of ingredients and collaborating on chocolate bars and chocolate beers and things like that. That was a lot of fun. We see that in some other areas of beverage alcohol, which we'll get to as well. But I noticed it initially with craft beer, and that's really what hooked me into chocolate originally, was actually through the beer side of things. So in the talk today, we're not going to get super technical. I am going to talk a little bit about ingredients and processes and things like that, but it's mostly just going to be for the sake of explaining how some of these bars taste. If any of you are chocolate makers or you want to understand more of the technical side of this stuff, by all means, reach out to me or find me after the talk, and we can dive in a little bit deeper on that stuff. So first thing I want to talk about is some of the types of collaborations we see very broadly, and then we're going to spend most of our time talking about some of the products that come out of these collaborations. So the first way that we see craft chocolate makers and beverage alcohol working together is with pairings. This is the lowest barrier of entry for craft chocolate makers to work with a producer, is to do some kind of pairing with their bars and those beverages. That doesn't require any kind of monetary investment to develop a new product, R&D, any of that. They can just reach out, say, let's get together and get some people, in a room and taste your whiskey or your beer, whatever, with our chocolate. We see a lot of that happening, and it's a fun way to kind of bridge those two worlds. What we're primarily going to focus on in just a moment is looking at chocolate that is using alcohol or ingredients used in some kind of alcohol, and beverages that are using some kind of cacao product, and looking at those two things together. So first of all, I want to talk about some of the reasons that we see these collaborations happening. Beyond just being something that tastes good, these things have to be beneficial to both companies, either commercially or creatively or both, in order to make that worth it. So one of the biggest things that we see, especially for the chocolate side of things, is in having access to a group of fans that they wouldn't necessarily have the ability to market to directly otherwise. So being able to reach out to craft beer fans or fans of bourbon who maybe have no awareness of craft chocolate. Those of us who are craft chocolate fans and we're working around this every day, it's super important to us, but it is largely invisible to much of the world. Like, this is a pretty anonymous industry in the broader culture. The term craft chocolate is something that most folks, I don't think, are even familiar with. So being able to go into a brewery tap room and say, this is a bar that we made with this beer, suddenly you're now opening that up to a whole new segment to be able to work with them. One potentially kind of like uncomfortable reality with this that I think we do have to acknowledge is that, right or wrong, there are still some gendered stereotypes around a lot of artisan foods and drinks. So a lot of people will assume that beer or whiskey is like a man's thing, and chocolate kind of sometimes has this feminine image, and wine can sometimes go that way. None of those things obviously have any gender, but we do have those stereotypes that are built up, and we kind of have to acknowledge those. And one of the things that working across these lines allows is it breaks down some of those barriers and allows folks to be able to freely approach either side of this collaboration without having any of that cultural baggage behind it. So if you go into a brewery and you've got bunch of bros with like straight rimmed baseball caps drinking IPA at the bar, they are probably not finding their way into the craft chocolate shop down the street very often. But you make a beer bar with IPA in it, and suddenly this is something that they feel is for them. And like, it allows for that cross collaboration that way to break down some of those cultural barriers. Additionally, this provides storytelling opportunities to existing customers for a brand. So most marketing, especially for craft chocolate, happens on social media. Instagram is kind of where these communities got built up over the last decade or so. And that can get really, really repetitive. No matter how excited you are about a new product, you're still just showing photos of chocolate, or you're still just trying to find a new way to explain why this single origin bar that you're breathlessly excited about is different from the single origin bar you were breathlessly excited about 3 weeks ago. And like, it's hard to get past that fatigue that customers get when they're seeing your stuff. Working with something wildly new and outside of your norm, barrel-aged beans or hops from brewing or something like that, allows for a break from that, and it gives you a new way to talk about your ingredients and your products and kind of reinvigorate your existing fan base. This can also provide ongoing revenue, particularly on the chocolate maker's side, not just from the sale of whatever specific product came out of a collaboration, but chocolate beer made with usually cacao nibs or some other products, we'll talk about that more in a little bit, are very, very popular. There are thousands of chocolate beers made across the country every year. A lot of those breweries are getting nibs from an ingredient supplier and don't necessarily have any relationship to where those came from. They don't maybe even know where they came from. They're calling up a beer ingredient supplier who is working with somebody who's bringing those nibs in, and those nibs are usually sitting in a warehouse for a while. They're not super fresh by the time they get to the brewery. If a chocolate maker does a collaboration, a one-off collaboration with a brewery, that provides an opportunity to start a conversation of, hey, we're right down the street. I can roast nibs for you the day before you need them to the roast level that you need. You can come in and taste different origins and figure out which one you want. And then every time that brewery makes a chocolate beer going forward, that is a revenue stream for that chocolate maker. There are several chocolate makers who this is a substantial part of their business, is providing nibs for breweries. Distilleries as well, but breweries by far more commonly. And then the last thing is a creative infusion for the folks who are working on the collaboration itself. Being a chocolate maker sounds exotic. Making beer for a living sounds like a really cool thing to do. Being a distiller, 70% of your time in any of those jobs is cleaning. It gets very repetitive. You're doing a lot of hard physical work. If you are the owner of the business, it is extremely stressful from a financial standpoint, and you better be in love with cleaning and sanitizing, because that's what you're doing all day as a brewer, especially. Doing a collaboration where you get together with creative people in a totally different field and work with ingredients you've never worked with before and experience flavors that maybe you're the first person to do this particular type of collaboration, and so you're creating a new type of product. that can go a long way to reminding you why you got into this in the first place and why this is actually a fun thing to be doing. So let's talk about chocolate made with different types of beverage alcohol. So the data for this graph and the following graphs is information that I've just gathered myself. This is not from any other source. I'm a huge nerd, so I have spreadsheets that are tracking like every collaboration that I find between craft chocolate and beverage alcohol. So this is looking at craft chocolate bars that are made with some kind of alcoholic beverage, and then the percentage of those bars represented by each type of beverage. So a couple things to note here. Looking at the ones that are a little bit less common, wine is something a lot of people associate with chocolate. Wine and chocolate is like an easy, combination that people are thinking of. In some ways that works against doing a collaboration because of the reason I was talking about of reaching out to a new audience. You aren't necessarily accessing a new audience by working with a winery. But beyond that, from a flavor standpoint, wine and chocolate can potentially have a lot of flavor overlap. Both have acidity, both have some dark fruit notes, different things like that. And if you are infusing chocolate with wine, it can be delicious. There are very good examples, but often you don't get as much contrast to really notice the wine in the bar as you do with some other drinks. So wine isn't quite as popular. Looking at something like mezcal, gin, we'll come back to those in just a moment. One of the big things holding those back, and it will always hold those back, is that those are more esoteric, challenging flavor profiles. They're kind of divisive. Not everybody likes smoky mezcal. Some people love it, some people don't. So while we're seeing growth in those areas, they're always going to be minorities in terms of the beverages worked with. Looking at these first two, you can see whiskey and beer are far and away the most popular. The beer one there is pretty easy to understand. As I mentioned, you've got a lot of similarities between the cultures of both of those. Craft beer has a very enthusiastic, social, fun-based fan base. And there is a lot of freedom to experiment, a lot of freedom of creativity within brewing. So being able to bring those together is a very natural combination in that way. But additionally, from a flavor standpoint, beer has the widest range of flavors of any beverage, any form of beverage alcohol. Doesn't mean that any individual beer is necessarily more complex than any other, but in terms of one beer being wildly different from another, you have well over 100 different styles of beer. So you can work with all kinds of different flavors to create a collaboration along these lines. And one particular note with that, in dark beer specifically, so like porters and stouts and things like that, the malt that we roast to get that color and get those roasty flavors gets roasted in a drum roaster almost identical to how we roast cacao beans for craft chocolate. So one of the reasons that you can get chocolatey flavors in some of those beers is because the process itself is creating that, the roasting process is creating that flavor similarity already. So you've already got some synergy between those. Whiskey, you can see, is definitely the most popular between these. One of those goes back to that some of those stereotypes I was talking about of being able to work across some of those gender stereotypes. Working with whiskey or bourbon or something like that is a fantastic way to be able to get men to come into a chocolate shop, honestly. And it's an interesting thing. We see a lot of like couples that will like have interest in those bars because both sides of this this couple are interested in it. Again, there's nothing gendered about these. Anybody can like any of them, but because some of those things exist, that is one reason for that. Beyond that, though, from a sensory standpoint, whiskey has a lot more complementary flavors for chocolate than you might think on the surface. The reason for that is because most of the flavor complexity in different types of whiskey is actually coming from the barrel, not from the base ingredients. The grains that are used are important, the fermentation is important. Most of your character in a finished whiskey is actually coming from the oak barrel that it's spending time in. Oak has some interesting flavor properties. Some of the flavors and aromas that we can get from oak-aged spirits are vanilla, caramel, baking spices, coconut. All of those are things that like we find in chocolate all the time. Those are natural complementary flavors for chocolate. So you're not asking of anything terribly challenging of combining those flavors with different types of chocolate, but what they are doing is providing a nice complementary supporting flavor and not overlapping with what's already in the bar. So you can get some surprising combinations but nothing that's going to be too challenging for anybody and ask them to, like with mezcal that we were just talking about, where some people might love that, but some people are going to be like, I did not want smoke in my chocolate bar. Whiskey does not require that of them. Let's break down whiskey just a little bit more. So looking at different types of this, you can see bourbon, far and away, not even close, the most popular for use in craft chocolate bars. Largely that is cultural. Bourbon rules the roost when it comes to American spirits. In fact, American artisan distilleries often start with the goal of being able to release their own bourbon. At the outset, they're going to make vodka and gin and things that they can turn over quickly to make money, but they kind of come of age when they release their first in-house bourbon. So just culturally, bourbon has this whole fandom around it. It's very, very popular. And so as from a marketing standpoint, having the word bourbon on the front of a chocolate bar is an automatic boost to it. Additionally, though, going back to what I was just talking about with the character of oak, bourbon, in order to be bourbon, you can only use a barrel one time. So bourbon is coming out of one-use barrels, and it is getting a lot of that oak character, very, very fresh out of there. So those complementary flavors that I was just mentioning, vanilla and caramel and spices and things like that, are very, very prevalent often in well-made bourbons. So those are easy complementary flavors for most chocolates. Going back to the different types of beverage alcohol that we see, one quick note on mezcal there. While it is on this chart the least popular, that is where I'm seeing the most growth just in the last year or two. I'm seeing a lot of makers that are starting to experiment with mezcal. Those are always going to be small batch bars, but we're seeing more folks work with it because it is unusual. And because it provides an interesting way to get smokiness into a bar. There are some makers who are actually smoking cacao nibs to get smoke flavors. This provides you a different way to do that, of not just having to actually smoke them, but you can get that in with another spirit. A number of Mexican craft chocolate makers are using mezcal as a way to kind of use a spirit from their culture along with Mexican cacao beans. So that's a lot of fun. In that other category down there at the end, it's literally every other kind of beverage alcohol, but nothing was common enough for its own silo here. So we see hard cider, brandy, vodka, anything under the sun, but those tend to be very, very limited. We don't see a whole lot of those. So let's talk about the methods of how this is done. How do we actually get the flavor of these beverages into chocolate? Because there is one massive, major challenge involved here in that you cannot use liquids in the chocolate making process. If you add a liquid when you're making chocolate, the sugar comes out of solution, it bonds with the liquid, and the chocolate seizes. We call it seizing. What it means is it turns it into a sticky, clumpy mass, and you can't turn it into finished chocolate after that. So you can't just take a good bourbon and pour it into the batch of chocolate and then have a bourbon-infused chocolate. So makers have to get creative with how they're going to do that. You can see by far the most popular method here is soaking nibs. That just means you're taking the cacao nibs that you're going to use for a chocolate bar, you're soaking them in whatever kind of beverage you're wanting to infuse, leave it in there for anywhere from a couple hours up to a couple weeks. A couple days is most common, and then take it out, dry it out, and go ahead and make chocolate out of those nibs, and you've infused the flavor of whatever that spirit is. You can see over 40% of the bars that I have tracked are using that method. Sometimes they're using that method and then another method as an accent to that, but most of the time, if a bar doesn't say what method they're using, there's a good chance that's what they're doing, is soaking the nibs. It also allows a very easy way to be able to taste test to know exactly when the chocolate or the cacao is at the spot that you want it to be, because it's soaking, so you can take it out, try one, see where you're at with that. Also very popular is barrel aging. This is when you're taking some kind of spirit barrel after it's been emptied out, putting the nibs in there, sealing it up, letting it sit for usually a few weeks up to several months, and then taking it back out. And what's really interesting about this is that you're not using the spirit itself in the chocolate. Cacao nibs are about 40% fat, and that fat is highly absorbent of aromas. So even though no actual spirit is going into the bar, just that time in the barrel absorbing those aromas. It's like if you leave cheese open in your fridge and sitting next to something else, and the next time you bite into the cheese, it tastes like pastrami or whatever else was in the fridge. Fat just absorbs all those aromatic compounds. Interesting thing with that, we don't have time to get into the sensory science on this in this talk, but most of our perception of flavor is actually coming from our sense of smell, not from our sense of taste. And this is a fun way to highlight that. There is no ingredient is going into the bar that you should be able to taste, but just the fact that those aromatics are infused will allow you to be able to taste it because of the way our brains process flavor. Later on this afternoon at 3:30, I'm leading a ticketed tasting of bars that are made with beer or spirits. We'll talk a little bit more about that then. This ingredients one is interesting. This is when you are not using the beverage itself, but just some kind of ingredient that is used in that beverage in the bars. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit because that is there's a very big difference in prevalence with that based on the type of drink that is being used. Fillings allow you to sidestep that liquid issue. This is when you're making either a ganache, a reduction, a caramel, and then just putting that inside of a chocolate like a bonbon or a filled bar of some kind. You're not actually using it in the chocolate itself, just in whatever kind of filling you're putting in there. So let's talk a little bit about the difference in the prevalence of these techniques between craft beer and spirits, because there are some big differences here just unique to craft beer versus everything else. Fillings, about the same, that's about as prevalent. Soaked nibs, as you can see, even though it's more popular with spirits, it's still quite common with craft beer. Big difference here in barrel aging, the biggest reason for that being that not many beers are barrel aged. There are some styles that do, but it's not the norm for most styles. There are a couple makers that are working with breweries that make bourbon barrel aged stouts and using those second use barrels for nibs, but it's still kind of a minor thing. This is the big one that I want to spend some time on, is that difference in the use of ingredients. This is the single most common method for making beer bars and almost non-existent for making anything else. There's like a couple examples of spirit bars made this way. The main thing being gins, using the botanicals after they've been taken out of the gin, using the botanicals as inclusions in the bar. Otherwise, this doesn't happen. The biggest reason for this is that beer not being distilled gets the majority of its character directly from the base ingredients that are going into the beer. And beer is unique in that it is always made from multiple ingredients rather than wine, which is made from just grapes, or coffee, just coffee beans, whiskey, just grain. Beer is going to be always made from barley malt or some other kind of grain, hops, which are a flower that has a whole bunch of different potential aromas and flavors in it, and gets a lot of its character from fermentation. Some fermentation notes get lost often in distillation for spirits, but they remain a lot of the times in beer. So all the 100+ beer styles that are out there, all the difference between them comes down to the exact ingredient selection between malt, hops, and what yeast you're using. And within those ingredients, within malts, for example, or grain, you have a rainbow of different flavor and color options of those, from those dark roasted ones that I mentioned a minute ago, to very, very pale, to ones that are crystallized, so they have a caramel-like flavor, whole range there. Hops, there's over 100 different commercial varieties of hops that all have different aroma properties to them, multiple different yeast strains that have very different characteristics. So working with the ingredients can allow you to evoke some of those flavors of beer, even if you're not using the beer itself. Yeast, we don't really see this done much because cacao already gets fermented at its point of origin. That's a spontaneous fermentation. We don't add any kind of fermentation culture to that. So it comes to us fermented, and there's nothing really to do after that point. That said, I am working with a cacao agronomist on a series of experiments with raw cacao pulp and beans and adding monoculture beer yeast to them to see what kind of fermentations we get and what flavors come out of that, as a possible way of doing some limited batch chocolates that way. We haven't done that yet. We've got all the yeast set up, and we're waiting to get our cacao for it. She's out of Trinidad and Tobago, so she's dependent on the calendar of when that is available. But I will be sharing all that information on the website when I have it ready. What we do see most commonly, though, is hops and malt. So looking at Beer bars. Hops, again, they're a flower that we use in beer, and they look like a little leafy green pine cone. They don't look like a typical flower. We use them for two different things in beer: bitterness, and then this wide range of flavors and aromas. And depending on what you want more of, you can use different types of hops and use them at different points in the brewing process. Some makers are using hops themselves, so actually grinding up whole hops and then distributing that in the chocolate bar. It is an interesting flavor, but I don't think it is the best way to do this, because in brewing, we're steeping the hops in the beer, and what we're actually doing is dissolving a waxy substance inside the hops called a lupulin that has all the aromatic compounds in it, getting that into the beer and then removing the physical hops. In this case, we're adding the entire hop flower, and the flavor can end up being a little bit like planty, a little green, and you don't actually get the really beautiful aromas that you can get from the hops in the beer. So what's more common and a really interesting method is aging bars with hops. So much like barrel aging that I was talking about just a minute ago, makers are making bars, not using any hops in the bars themselves, making finished chocolate bars, and then aging those with hops. So packing them into hops, putting them into containers, and just letting them sit for like 3 or 4 weeks. And the fat in the bar absorbs all the aromatics of the hops. And at the end, you get like these bright hoppy aromas, but none of the bitterness from the plantiness of the plant matter of the hops in there at all. This is a really fun way to illustrate the different uses of hops in beer, ironically. I've used this in lessons talking about like how we get bitterness in beer versus how we get those hop aromas, because there's one maker that makes 2 different bars. We sold out of one of them at the booth. I had both of them over there. One of them is steeped in beer, and the other one is just aged in hops. And so in both cases, you can see one that just has the hop aroma, one that has the hop bitterness from actually being steeped in there. So kind of a fun crossover between those. And then malt down at the end, being the fermentable base in beer, and being a familiar flavor for a lot of folks, because malt powder gets used in malt milkshakes, malted milk balls, things like that. So a lot of makers are doing either bars made with malt powder to get that very familiar nostalgic flavor of chocolate malt, or using actual malts like kernels and putting them in the bar largely for texture, kind of the way that some places will put cacao nibs on the back of their bar. Using barley malt in the bar will add some texture as well as flavor. Has anybody here ever had the black and burnt barley bar from Omnom out of Iceland? So it's a really surprising bar. It is jet black, like not just dark chocolate, like the color black. It's a white chocolate. They add activated charcoal to it to make it black because they want it to look like the volcanic sand on their beaches in Iceland. But the bar has a couple different kinds of barley malt in it, and it happened because they were doing a pairing with a brewery. The brewery brought the stuff to the chocolate factory, and they had brought some ingredients so that attendees could see what malt was like and what hops were like. And then they left them there at the end of the night. So the next day, the makers were like, well, what are we supposed to do with all this barley malt? And they started experimenting with it, and now it is, I believe it's their best-selling or second best-selling bar. Just kind of an accident that came out of that. So let's talk a little bit about the opposite side of these collaborations. So beer and spirits that are made with cacao or chocolate in some way. As I said, by far, beer is the most common beverage for this. There are exceptions to that. There are some rums in particular that are made with cacao. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do, because chocolate flavors are something that we have largely divorced from their point of origin, because chocolate is something that we find comfort in. Maybe it's something that happens as a gift at Halloween or Christmas or something like that. We forget that this is a tropical fruit that's growing around the equator. And so using rum, something that we associate with tropical flavors and tiki drinks and things like that, and infusing it with cacao is an interesting way to highlight that, yes, we have these associations with chocolate, but in reality, it is grown around the equator, in farms in tropical climates. So that's kind of fun. We don't really see this much in whiskey or wine or any of those others, largely because of that tradition that is built up around those. There are a few places that are putting cacao nibs into gin as one botanical within, a large recipe of botanicals that are going into that. So it's a fun thing to do, but you can't necessarily taste them and pick out like an actual chocolatey flavor from it. Beer, however, uses cacao all the time. There are literally thousands of chocolate beers made across the country. So let's talk about some of the ways that this is done using cacao itself. By far, the most popular method of doing this is using cacao nibs. I would say 90 to 95% of the time, chocolate beers are made with the nibs, which is just the fragments of the cocoa beans themselves. Typically what happens is the maker or the brewer will put the nibs into mesh bags and then just steep it in the beer kind of like a tea. So after the beer is completely finished with fermentation and you're on to the conditioning phase, which is right before it's going to get packaged, it's just chilling out at a cold temperature, they will steep the bags of cacao nibs in there for anywhere from usually 4 to 6 days, and then take those out, and now you've got a chocolate-infused beer. There are some brewers who will do recirculation methods, so they'll take external filters, fill them with cacao nibs, and then pump the beer through it, so it's continually getting filtered through the nibs. That is a really good way for brewers to be able to control exactly how much flavor they're getting from the nibs, because that's continually circulating and mixing. At any point, they can take samples out and say, this is exactly where I want to stop. Whereas with you're just steeping those bags in there, and that has to kind of then be mixed together, and it can be a little bit more challenging. So we see nibs all the time. Most of the time, this is porters and stouts because they already have some chocolatey flavors to them. I would love to see more breweries using cacao nibs in other beer styles, because this doesn't just have to be a heavy, roasty, chocolatey flavor. It can be an accent to other flavors. There are a handful of breweries who have used this in some paler styles, and I wish it would catch on more. One of the things we've seen a lot of popularity with in the last 5 or 10 years is pale coffee beers. So where coffee sometimes gets used in porters and stouts, there's a lot of beers now being made that are just like light, pale, easy drinking beers, but they have this fresh little pop of coffee flavor in them, and I'd like to see more brewers doing that with cacao nibs. There are also brewers working with cacao husks. So around the bean, you have a thin, brittle husk. Usually it is a waste product in the chocolate making process. It can be mulched or composted, but most of the time it is just waste and has to be thrown away. But those husks still have a nice cocoa flavor to them. So there are some brewers who are now working with the husks. This is a benefit for both the brewer and the chocolate maker, because the husks, being a waste product, are cheaper for the brewer, and it provides some revenue for the chocolate maker, who otherwise this would have just been thrown away. It's a little bit of a additional income. So the husks don't have the intensity of character of the nibs. They don't have that full chocolatiness. It's more of like a light, drier cocoa-like flavor. So when we see this used, it is usually in something like a sour, where you're not wanting a big chocolate flavor to contrast with that acidity. You just want a little bit of an accent. This is also good in sour beer styles, because the foam that gets poured on the top of beer is a difficult achievement for brewers to get right on there, and it is a protein matrix. All of that foam is coming from protein in the malt. If anybody here has ever tried to make whipped cream or meringue from egg whites, if you get a tiny bit of the egg yolk in there, it just destroys it, and you can't actually get that foam. The egg white is protein, the egg yolk is fat, and the fat will annihilate that protein structure. Same thing happens with beer foam. If you get too much fat into that beer, it will prevent that foam from forming on top of the beer, and it won't stick around in the glass and look really pretty. With sour beers, because of the way they're fermented, the fermentation will already break down some of that protein structure, so you're already struggling to get foam formation. And if you add nibs in there with their fat content, often you will get no foam on top of those at all. So using husks in those beers is a way to avoid having to get that fat in there, and you can get some head retention in the beer. We're also seeing a handful of breweries working with cocoa butter, so the fat that comes out of the beans. as we just talked about with the fat, obviously too much of this is going to create problems. So this is already a challenge. There's only a couple brewers who are doing it, but there's some really interesting flavors that you can get from it. Most of the cocoa butter that we encounter is deodorized, but cocoa butter as it comes out of the bean actually still has a lot of character to it. So working with non-deodorized cocoa butter, there's one brewer in particular in North Carolina who's making a peach sour ale. And what they do is chill the beer down and then take slabs of cocoa butter and just put it in the bottom of the beer and let it sit on that for a couple days. And what they get out of it is like a peaches and cream flavor in the finished beer. Then they take the cocoa butter and they make ice cream in their restaurant. So a really fun way to bring together these different flavors. Not many places are doing this, and it's never going to be hugely popular, but it is kind of a fun curiosity of working with an unexpected ingredient. And then lastly, something exciting that we just started seeing in the last few years is working with the fruit pulp itself. So the cacao beans that we make chocolate from are beans inside a larger fruit. I'm sure you've seen examples of some of the pods out here. The fruit pulp is very bright and expressive, and you get descriptions like mango and melon and like all sorts of different bright fruit flavors. We don't really ever get the pulp up here in North America. It perishes very quickly. So at points of origin, it can be consumed, but most people in North America have no idea what cacao fruit pulp actually tastes like. Chocolate Thunder out here in the vendor area has pouches of cacao fruit puree, if you want to find out what that tastes like. But Cocoa Supply, who is the main sponsor of this festival, has started importing 2 different kinds of cacao pulp for brewers here in North America, both a puree and a freeze-dried powder. And there are now some brewers working with that. Fruit beers are quite popular, and this provides one way not only to tell the story of cacao in a surprising way. Most people don't realize this even comes from a fruit, but also to get a new and exciting fruit flavor that they haven't used a dozen times already. So I've worked with a couple breweries where I am over in Dayton, Ohio, to work with this pulp. And this provides an opportunity to use a beer style other than porter and stout. So a blonde ale or something that's just very, very mild in flavor allows those fruit flavors to really pop out of there. This is not uncommon in countries of origin where cacao is being grown and they can actually get fruit pulp more freshly. So we were in Ecuador last summer and there were several beers in Quito that were using cacao fruit pulp. But in North America, it's still pretty new. Last method we see is using chocolate itself, and I will say that this is not really a great way of doing this. It is much better to use the base ingredients to get a truer flavor. When you're adding chocolate, you're not just adding the cacao. That bar probably has sugar in it. It might have added cocoa butter, whatever else. And it's very difficult to get that to actually melt and circulate within the chocolate. The few examples where I've seen this done, it will often over time drop out of solution and like you're not even getting the true flavor in the beer. Usually if you see a brewer say that they used whole chocolate bars, it's largely for the marketing boost of like, we dropped whole chocolate bars in this beer, and like it's kind of a gimmick. The better way to get the flavor is definitely to use the cacao itself. Last thing I want to look at is one quick case study. This is Aeronaut Brewing and Somerville Chocolate. Aeronaut is in a neighborhood of Boston called Somerville, and Somerville Chocolate rents space out of the brewery. So they share production space, and it allows for this constant exchange of ingredients and creative ideas between them. So in the case of this beer dark chocolate right here, which I actually have out at our booth, they are giving cacao nibs to the brewer. The brewer is steeping it in primary fermentation during the beer. So when the beer is at the peak of its fermentation, they're steeping the cacao in there. Then they take it back out, give those nibs to the maker. Maker dries them out and makes this bar out of it. So if you're at that brewery, you can taste the milk stout that was made with the cacao and then taste the bar with the cacao that came out of that beer and taste them side by side. This bar, the Hopstark Milk, is one of those ones that, as I was talking about earlier, that's just aged in hops. They're not actually using hops in it, but they're sealing it in with that. And you get this really bright aroma, but none of the bitterness of the hops. These bars here, these beer-soaked chocolate, that was an experiment they did last year that would have been very difficult to do if they weren't in such close proximity. The brewer created a Baltic porter, which is a strong porter style that doesn't have the intense roastiness of like an imperial stout. It just has some of those softer chocolate flavors, but it's a pretty strong beer. They took a portion of that and split it apart and aged it in 2 different bourbon barrels. And then in each bourbon barrel, they put 2 different types of cacao. So the chocolate maker took an Ecuadorian cacao, roasted part of it to a really dark, intense roast, and then with the other did a very light roast, and they put those separately into the barrels, and then the light roast also got some vanilla beans. They let that age, drained the beer off into those 2 batches, and then gave all of those ingredients back to the maker. And Somerville Chocolate made 1 bar out of the intensely roasted cacao that had come out of the one, and then used both the light roast cacao and the vanilla from the other barrel in the other bar. Then they sold those together as a pack, and if you were at the brewery, you could try both of those beers and both of the chocolate bars and get this full picture of the variety of possibilities there. So just being in close proximity like that and being able to work with somebody in a totally different craft segment who is similarly interested in flavors and ingredients allows you to kind of think about what's possible in each of those in completely new ways. Out at our booth, we sold out of the Hops Dark Milk Bar, but we do still have this Beer Dark Chocolate and a brand new Mezcal bar that they just came out with that's infused with, they just soak the nibs in the Mezcal and then take it back out from there. So out at our table, these are the bars we have available. If you want to check out some of these, we are sold out of that Hops Dark Milk, and we might be sold out of the Mint Julep, but we have all these others available. This Violet Sky Bar is an Indiana maker, and they made 16 bars in that batch and gave us 15 of them. So it is super, super limited. And then this afternoon at 3:30, I am leading a ticketed tasting of 5 of these bars where we'll talk about the techniques used for each of them and walk through that information. And then I also have a book, Pairing Beer and Chocolate, that's available out at the booth. Finally, if you're not already familiar with Bean to Barstool, as I said, we kind of look at all the stuff we've been talking about here today. So all the different intersections and collaborations between these industries, as well as pairing guidance. We do interviews with brewers, chocolate makers, expert tasters, and things like that. So you can check that out. Otherwise, if you have any questions, I can stick around for a few minutes, but I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me for a little while. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
Hops are infused with the finished chocolate bar versus the nibs.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I understood your question.
When you infuse the hops, that's done with the finished bar versus
correct. Yes, I see. Yeah, so they're making the bars, and then they're taking the bars and putting them in the hops. You could probably do it with nibs. The thing that would happen though is that when you're making those nibs and refining and conching, you'd blow off a lot of those volatiles and you probably wouldn't have much character left in the finished bar. So by finishing the bar, you can infuse it and you don't lose anything. Yeah. With the barrel aging, you have to do the nibs. So you probably, I would say you do lose a little bit of the delicacy of some of the complexity of the spirits in those barrels, and you're getting more of just like that familiar, spirit barrel-aged spirit aroma in the bar. But with the hops, with the delicacy of some of those like light fruit and floral notes and things like that, you'd probably lose most of it if you were doing it with nibs. Yeah?
I did a bourbon barrel, soaked the nibs. I used a pancake funnel that broke when I was trying to do it, so I had to kind of let this chocolate reset, order another one, and the next one, the orifice was so small, I just couldn't pour it in my mold, so I had to do it a third time with one that I really liked, but I lost some of the bourbon the third time, heating it up to 115, melt all the 6 crystals, and I just lost a lot of that with a little gentle heat. I was really surprised.
I will say that some of the complexity of individual spirits gets lost a little bit in doing this. And the same thing happens in the other direction with like chocolate beers. You can taste different origins of cacao to use in those, and it will have an influence. But if anybody is doing that, I wouldn't recommend that they expect all of the nuance that they got out of the nibs to be in the finished beer. There will be distinctions, but the process of that getting mixed into the beer and getting, everything that happens after that, you're not going to get every little nuanced note that you got from that origin. I would say the same thing happens in the other direction with the spirit soaking. Yeah. Any other questions?